Hello, dear listeners. The story we will explore together today is truly fascinating, yet profound. Have you ever had such thoughts while reading history books? Why do so many empires rise and fall? Why is human history filled with endless conflicts and wars? I have had these questions in my heart since childhood. Why did the Roman Empire, which was so mighty, collapse? How could the great civilization of Babylon disappear overnight? And will the superpowers of our current era also eventually fade into the background of history? I still remember the map of the Roman Empire I first saw in my middle school history textbook. Looking at that vast territory spanning Europe, Africa, and Asia, I wondered, how could such a great empire collapse? But as time passed, I learned that no empire in history has been eternal. The Egyptian Empire lasted for an amazing 3,000 years, but eventually disappeared, and China's various dynasties also lasted for centuries before being replaced. Even the British Empire, called the Empire on which the sun never sets, was dismantled in the 20th century. Today, we want to think about these questions together from a biblical perspective, specifically around the core question: why does God use human history as a stage for judgment? This question goes beyond mere curiosity about past history and is directly connected to fundamental understanding of the present we live in and the future we will face. We live in confusing times. Pandemics, wars, climate change, economic instability. In all of this, we find ourselves asking, where is God? Chapter 1. Discovering God's hand in history. There are two main perspectives from which we view history. One is the secular perspective, which sees history simply as the result of human choices and coincidences. The other is the biblical perspective, which sees all of history unfolding within God's sovereign providence. The famous German philosopher Hegel expressed this as the cunning of reason. He saw history as developing according to some grand logic. But the Bible goes a step further, saying that the master of that grand logic is God himself. Hegel's philosophy of history is very interesting. He saw history progressing through the dialectical development of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. For example, he analyzed how ancient Greek democracy met Roman imperialism to form Christian civilization. However, Hegel said there was an absolute spirit behind all this process, which from a biblical perspective can be seen as God's providence. Let us look at Daniel 2:21 together. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. Here we must pay attention to the expression that God raises up kings and deposes them. Looking more closely at the Hebrew of this verse reveals even more amazing meaning. Raises up is hakim, meaning to raise up or to exalt, and deposes is hashefa, meaning to humble or to bring low. This means God actively controls the fate of rulers. The Roman historian Livy, while recording the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, connected human morality with the empire's fate. He saw that when Rome became corrupt, the empire also collapsed together. This remarkably aligns with the biblical perspective. Reading Livy's History of Rome, we can discover an interesting pattern. When Rome was strong, citizens were described as frugal and courageous. Conversely, when Rome weakened, luxury and corruption were depicted as rampant. For example, Romans during the Punic Wars were prepared to sacrifice their lives for their country. But after securing dominance over the Mediterranean, political corruption and moral decay began. Consider the Babylonian Empire. Babylon, which reached its peak during Nebuchadnezzar's reign, is compared to a head of gold in Daniel. But when they became proud and began to ignore God, Fingers appeared one night at Belshazzar's feast and wrote on the wall, declaring the empire's end. Looking closely at the scene of Belshazzar's feast in Daniel 5, we see not just individual pride, but the corruption of an entire civilization. King Belshazzar drank wine from the sacred vessels taken from the Jerusalem temple and praised idols. This was a direct challenge to God. But looking deeper, Babylon's destruction wasn't simply due to personal sins alone. Babylon was politically corrupt in its bureaucracy, economically marked by excessive luxury and inequality, socially characterized by moral decay, and religiously marked by idolatry and pride. All these factors worked together to bring about the empire's downfall. The Assyrian Empire was similar. In the Old Testament, Assyria was used as God's instrument to discipline Israel. In Isaiah 10:5, God says, "Woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger, in whose hand is the club of my wrath." But when Assyria forgot that they were God's instrument and became proud, God judged them too. Isaiah 10:12 declares, "When the Lord has finished all his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria for the willful pride of his heart and the haughty look in his eyes." Looking at the Persian Empire, we can discover even more interesting patterns. Cyrus the Great was called his anointed one in the Bible and was used in God's plan. He destroyed Babylon and returned the Jews to their homeland. But Persia also gradually became proud and corrupt, especially during the reign of Xerxes, Ahasuerus. Excessive luxury and abuse of power were rampant. The feast of King Ahasuerus described in Esther lasted for 180 days. This was to display the empire's wealth and power, but it was also a sign of internal corruption. The case of the Greek Empire, especially Alexander the Great, was similar. He built the world's largest empire at just 32 years old, but died young due to pride and debauchery. His empire immediately split into 4 parts. This precisely matches the prophecy in Daniel. Alexander's Eastern expedition appeared to begin from personal ambition, but ultimately laid the foundation for later gospel propagation through the spread of Hellenistic culture, Greek becoming the common language throughout the Mediterranean, Greek philosophy connecting East and West. All of this can be seen as occurring within God's providence. The case of the Roman Empire is more complex. Rome lasted longer than other empires and witnessed the important historical event of Christianity's emergence and spread during this process. Early Roman republicanism emphasized civic virtue and public good. But gradually, individual desires and pursuit of power came to overwhelm the common good. Caesar's rise and the fall of the Republic, Augustus's establishment of the empire. Looking at how all these processes align with God's timetable is truly amazing. That Jesus was born precisely when Augustus's census decree was issued was no coincidence. But here a question arises. If all history unfolds according to God's plan, do human choice and free will have meaning? This is a problem that has been discussed in theology for a long time. Augustine said, God's predestination and human free will do not contradict each other. This is because God's predestination is accomplished through human free choices. It's like an excellent conductor who brings out each performer's individuality while completing a beautiful symphony overall. Augustine's insight into this problem is very deep. In his City of God, we can see his effort to harmonize human free will with God's predestination. According to Augustine, God foreknows human free choices and accomplishes his will through them. For example, consider Joseph's story. Joseph's brothers sold him to Egypt out of their own free will in their hatred. But God used even that evil act to fulfill his plan of saving the nation of Israel. When Joseph told his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good," this is precisely what he meant. Thomas Aquinas also dealt with this problem deeply. He distinguished between God's omniscience and human free will. God's foreknowledge of the future doesn't make human choices deterministic, just as a historian's knowledge of past events doesn't make those events necessary. Calvin emphasized God's sovereignty even more strongly. In his Institutes of the Christian Religion, he explains that God's predestination was determined from eternity. But Calvin didn't deny human responsibility either. Rather, he saw God's sovereignty and human responsibility as paradoxically compatible. The Bible presents a very balanced perspective on this issue. Looking at Acts 17:26-27, from one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. What we should note in this passage is the part where God marked out their appointed times and the boundaries of their lands. This means the rise and fall of each nation and country is also within God's plan. But the purpose is so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, to provide opportunities for salvation. Looking at modern history, we can discover similar patterns. Consider the 2 world wars of the 20th century. Humanly speaking, they were terrible disasters, but as a result, the imperialist era ended and national self-determination spread. Also, the Holocaust provided the opportunity for Israel's re-establishment. In the case of World War I, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire completely changed the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. This connected to the Balfour Declaration, giving momentum to the Jewish return movement to Palestine. Of course, there was much suffering and conflict in this process, but from a biblical perspective, it can be seen as the process of fulfilling God's promises. World War II is even more complex. Hitler's Nazism was clearly an evil ideology. But as a result, Western civilization came to reflect on its own arrogance and prejudices, and human rights consciousness greatly developed. The establishment of the UN and development of international law also occurred. The Cold War era was similar. There was much suffering due to ideological confrontation, but in the process, democracy and human rights consciousness spread worldwide. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union opened new opportunities for gospel propagation. It's amazing to see how Christianity survived and developed in communist countries. In China's case, underground churches grew rapidly, even during the extreme persecution of the Cultural Revolution. In Russia's case, the Orthodox Church maintained its existence during 70 years of communist rule and rapidly revived after the Soviet collapse. Chapter 2. History as a Stage of Judgment. Looking at history, we can discover one amazing pattern. Extremely corrupt and evil empires suddenly collapse at some point. Is this coincidence? Sociologist Arnold Toynbee explained the rise and fall of civilizations from the perspective of challenge and response in A Study of History. According to him, civilizations develop when they respond creatively to challenges and decline when they fail to do so. But from a biblical perspective, we can see God's hand behind these challenges as well. Looking more closely at Toynbee's theory, he explains the development process of civilizations centered on the role of creative minorities. When civilizations face challenges, creative minorities present new solutions, and civilization develops as the masses imitate them. But when creative minorities deteriorate into dominant minorities, civilizations begin to decline. Interpreting this perspective biblically, we can see that God raises up necessary leaders in each era to accomplish His will. And when those leaders leave God and become proud, they receive judgment. For example, consider Hitler's Nazi Germany. When their evil deeds reached their peak, the whole world united to bring them down. Many historians analyze this in terms of various factors, but from a biblical perspective, It can be seen as one of God's ways of restraining evil. Looking closely at Nazi Germany's destruction process, it's truly a series of amazing coincidences. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, bringing America into the war, defeat at Stalingrad, the success of D-Day, etc. Each was a combination of human choices and various factors. But overall, it shows the historical law that evil forces are destined to perish. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union was militarily very irrational. Opening the Eastern Front and fighting a two-front war while not even finishing the Western Front was suicidal. Many military experts analyze this as Hitler's fatal mistake, but from a biblical perspective, it can be seen as God confusing the minds of the proud and making them go toward their own destruction. Stalin was similar. Even though most of the Soviet army's high-ranking officers were eliminated due to his Great Purge, being able to ultimately stop Germany was nearly miraculous from a human perspective. When German forces advanced to the outskirts of Moscow in 1941, the Soviet collapse seemed a matter of time. But the unexpectedly harsh cold that came at just the right time, reinforcements from Siberia, and the Soviet people's unexpected will to resist changed the direction of history. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Old Testament times was similar. When their evil was complete before God, they were judged with sulfur and fire. This isn't simply a thing of the past, but shows a typical case of how God deals with evil through history. The case of the Spanish and Portuguese empires of the 16th and 17th centuries also provides interesting examples. They discovered the New World and built colonies, monopolizing the world's wealth. Spain especially became Europe's strongest nation due to the enormous amounts of gold and silver flowing from the American continent. But their colonial management methods were very cruel. They destroyed Aztec and Inca civilizations, enslaved natives, and imported large numbers of African slaves. They also oppressed other religions through forced Catholicism and the Inquisition. Dominican monks like Bartolomé de las Casas advocated for indigenous rights and protested to the Spanish government, but their voices were drowned out by economic interests. But God's judgment was slowly approaching. From the 17th century, the Spanish Empire began to decline. Inflation due to gold and silver flowing from America, decline of manufacturing, defeat of the Invincible Armada, losses in the 30 Years' War all worked together. The defeat of the Invincible Armada in the 1588 naval battle with England was especially symbolic. What helped the English forces then was an unexpected storm. The English called this the wind sent by God. Of course, this could be seen simply as a weather phenomenon, but from a biblical perspective, it can be interpreted as God's judgment on a proud empire. Portugal's case was similar. They gained enormous wealth from colonies in Brazil and Asia, but have a history stained with the slave trade and exploitation of natives. The Lisbon earthquake of the 18th century is considered a symbolic event of the Portuguese Empire's decline. Voltaire looked at this Lisbon earthquake and asked, "If God exists, why do innocent people suffer?" But from a biblical perspective, this can be seen not as judgment on individual sins, but as a warning about the sins of civilization as a whole. Looking at history from a broader perspective, we can see that God used the empires of each era as instruments for advancing salvation history. Were the stories of Daniel and his 3 friends maintaining their faith even in a foreign land during the Babylonian exile, Esther saving her people in the Persian court, all these things just coincidences? Looking closely at Daniel, we can see how God accomplishes his will even through foreign empires. Daniel and his 3 friends becoming Babylonian officials, Nebuchadnezzar having dreams, and Daniel interpreting them, God's power being revealed through the fiery furnace incident. None of this was coincidental. Daniel 2's dream interpretation especially has very important meaning. Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue was a prophecy showing the flow of future world history, It prophesied that the golden head, silver chest and arms, bronze belly and thighs, iron legs, and feet mixed with iron and clay would arise in succession. And finally, it prophesied that a stone cut out, but not by human hands, would strike the statue and crush it, and that stone would become a great mountain filling the whole earth. This means God's kingdom will replace all human empires. Esther's case is similar. On the surface, it seems like a secular story where God's name doesn't even appear, but actually God's providence permeates every corner. Esther becoming queen, Mordecai discovering the plot to assassinate the king, Haman's scheme being revealed. Everything happened with exquisite timing. Especially in Esther 4:14 when Mordecai tells Esther, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" This shows confidence in God's providence. Jesus' coming during the Roman Empire was similar. Rome's road network and the universalization of Greek language, the peaceful period of Pax Romana, all these created optimal conditions for gospel propagation. When Paul expressed, "When the set time had fully come," in Galatians 4:4, this is precisely what he meant. The time when Jesus was born was indeed when optimal conditions for gospel propagation were established. Under Roman rule, the entire Mediterranean region was unified as one political unit. Koine Greek was used as a common language, and Rome's road system made travel easy. Religiously, monotheistic thought had already spread throughout the Mediterranean through the Jewish diaspora. Philosophical thinking had developed due to Hellenistic influence. Politically, it was the relatively peaceful period of Pax Romana, and socially, there was skepticism about existing religions and longing for new religions. One thing that amazed me when I studied church history in seminary was how the gospel could spread so rapidly throughout the Roman Empire. The transportation networks, common language, and religious tolerance of that time all worked favorably for gospel propagation. Tracking Paul's missionary journeys on a map reveals an amazing fact. His missionary routes mostly followed Rome's major road networks, through the Egnatian Way to Macedonia and Achaia, through the Appian Way to Rome. All these roads became channels for the gospel. Paul's Roman citizenship was also God's providence. Thanks to this citizenship, he could escape crises several times and ultimately gained the opportunity to preach the gospel in Rome. The scene at the end of Acts where Paul freely preaches the gospel in Rome is very symbolic. The rapid growth of the early church despite persecution is also amazing. Though there were severe persecutions under Nero, Domitian, Decius and others, these persecutions rather served as catalysts for gospel expansion. Tertullian said, "The blood of martyrs is the seed of the church." Indeed, many who witnessed martyrs' deaths became interested in Christianity and eventually converted. God used even persecution as a tool for gospel propagation. Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan were no coincidence. Constantine's victory over Maxentius after seeing a cross vision and then recognizing Christianity was a turning point in Roman history. Subsequently, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, laying the foundation for the gospel to spread throughout Europe. Chapter 3. History as a foreshadowing of final judgment. Reading the Bible, we can see that judgments in history ultimately serve as foreshadowings that preview the final judgment of the last day, like how previews show the movie's content in advance. Karl Barth expressed this as eternity within time. God's eternal judgment is partially and preliminarily revealed in time. Barth's concept provides very important theological insight. According to him, all events in history are partial revelations in the time dimension of God's judgment and salvation in the eternal dimension. In other words, Historical events are previews of eschatological reality. Consider the flood judgment in Noah's time. 2. Peter 3 connects this flood judgment with the final fire judgment. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. By the same word the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. Looking closely at the pattern of flood judgment reveals an amazing structure. First, there was a long period of warning. God gave a grace period of 120 years. During this time, Noah, as a preacher of righteousness, urged people to repent. But people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away, as Jesus said in Matthew 24:38-39. This exactly matches the situation of the last times. Another notable point in the flood judgment is that there was only one way of salvation. There was no way to be saved except through the ark. This connects to the New Testament message that there is no salvation except through Jesus Christ. The Tower of Babel incident also serves as an important event, foreshadowing end-time situations. Looking at Genesis 11, humanity with one language and one goal tried to build a tower that reaches to the heavens. Their purpose was to make a name for ourselves so that we may not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. What's important in the Tower of Babel incident is not simply that they built a tall building, but that it was a proud attempt to reach heaven without God. They said, "Let us build ourselves a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves." This was an attempt to invade God's realm. Looking at modern civilization, we can find aspects similar to Babel. Due to scientific and technological development, some people think humans have gained godlike abilities. Through artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space development, etc., they believe humans can solve all problems. Some entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley even declare they will make humans immortal beings. Google founder Larry Page said, "Death is a problem to be solved," and Tesla's Elon Musk is developing technology to upload human brains to computers. These attempts seem no different from building the Tower of Babel. But God brought down the Tower of Babel and scattered humanity. This was an event that broke human pride and confirmed God's sovereignty. Similarly, in modern times, when humans become too proud, God will intervene to reveal human limitations. Looking at Daniel's record of Babylon's destruction, it has symbolic meaning, showing not just one empire's end, but the ultimate fate of all forces opposing God. Babylon in Daniel is not just a historical empire, but the archetype of worldly powers opposing God. Babylon's characteristics, pride, idolatry, challenge to God, oppression of people, are common traits of evil powers in all eras. The incident where Nebuchadnezzar erected a golden image and made everyone bow to it is very symbolic. This was an attempt for political power to seize religious authority as well. Modern totalitarian states show similar patterns. Consider fascism and communism. Hitler idolized the German race, and Kim Il-sung and Stalin almost deified themselves. In Mao's China, worship of Mao personally reached religious dimensions. They all showed aspects similar to Babylon's Nebuchadnezzar, but such empires eventually collapsed. Nazi Germany perished in just 12 years, and the Soviet Union also dissolved in just 70 years. This shows that Daniel's prophecies continue to be fulfilled. The reappearance of the name Babylon in Revelation as a symbol of worldly powers is in the same context. Babylon's destruction in history serves as a foreshadowing that all forces opposing God will be destroyed in the last times. The case of the Roman Empire has even more complex meaning. Rome was used as a tool for gospel propagation on one hand, but was also a force persecuting Christianity on the other. Roman emperor worship directly conflicted with Christianity. The demand to worship the emperor as God and confess Caesar as Lord was incompatible with Christianity's confession that Jesus is Lord. Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians was particularly brutal. Christians were thrown to lions, crucified, and even covered with tar, and used as torches in gardens, according to historian Tacitus. Peter and Paul also were martyred during this period. But interestingly, Nero ultimately ended his life by suicide due to his evil deeds. And the Roman Empire itself gradually walked the path of decline. Due to the 3rd century crisis, barbarian invasions, internal divisions, etc., the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. Even more amazing is the fact that Christianity, which had been persecuted, ultimately conquered the Roman Empire. With Constantine's conversion, Christianity became Rome's official religion, and under Theodosius, it became the state religion. This can be seen as the fulfillment of Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed. Verses 1 to 2. But ultimately, the one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Verse 4. The Islamic Empire that emerged in the 7th century also provides interesting examples. Islam built a vast empire from the Arabian Peninsula to Spain to India in just 100 years. There were several factors in Islam's rapid expansion. The Byzantine Empire and Persian Empire were exhausted from long wars. There was a simple and clear religious message, tolerant governing policies, all worked together. Particularly notable is that Islam conquered many Christian regions. Egypt, North Africa, Syria, Asia Minor, important strongholds of the early church came under Islamic rule. But from a biblical perspective, this too can be seen as within God's providence. The Christian world at that time was in serious chaos due to doctrinal disputes and divisions. Due to monophysite controversies, iconoclastic movements, etc., the church was losing its original mission. Also, Islam thoroughly rejected idolatry and emphasized Allah's unity. This served as a kind of warning message to the corrupt Christian world. But Islamic empires also experienced division and decline over time. Through the Umayyad, Abbasid, and Ottoman dynasties, they gradually became secularized and corrupt. Especially the Ottoman Empire declined so much in the 19th and 20th centuries that it was called the sick man of Europe, and was ultimately dismantled after World War I. Modern sociologist Max Weber warned that as bureaucracy and rationalization progress, humans become trapped in an iron cage. As technology and systems develop, human freedom becomes constrained. But from a biblical perspective, ultimately only God's kingdom is eternal, and all human systems are temporary. Weber's iron cage theory provides an important key to understanding modern society. He saw the rationalization process of Western society as increasingly confining humans within rigid bureaucratic systems. In pursuing efficiency and predictability, human creativity and spirituality are suppressed. But from a biblical perspective, such human systems will ultimately receive God's judgment. Just as the Tower of Babel collapsed, all the grand systems humans create must collapse before God. Chapter 4. Modern Application and Practice. So what does this truth that God uses history as a stage of judgment mean for our individual lives? First, the importance of humility. We must remember that all empires in history collapsed when they became proud. The same is true in individual life. When we think we're doing well, when we become complacent about success, that's the most dangerous moment. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman spoke about human cognitive biases in Thinking Fast and Slow. He said we tend to overestimate our abilities and see our success as inevitable rather than coincidental. But the Bible warns that pride goes before destruction. According to Kahneman's research, humans show overconfidence phenomena. Especially successful people tend to overestimate their abilities and underestimate the role of luck. This exactly matches the essence of pride that the Bible warns against. Looking at history, there are many cases of leaders who achieved great personal success but fell due to pride. Napoleon boasted, "Impossible is not in my dictionary," but ultimately was defeated at Waterloo. Hitler, too, intoxicated by early consecutive victories, invaded the Soviet Union and received a fatal blow at Stalingrad. The same is true in individual life. When business is going well, when health is good, when relationships are smooth, we easily become proud. But Proverbs 16:18 clearly warns, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." Second, we must have historical consciousness. We must have the awareness that the era we live in is also within God's plan. We must realize that we're not living alone, but have our role in God's grand history. This means more than simply pursuing personal success. It means living a life that seeks God's kingdom and His righteousness. When Jesus said in Matthew 6:33, "But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well," this is precisely what He meant. Having historical consciousness also means understanding the characteristics and challenges of the era we live in. The 21st century is the information age, the globalization age, the multicultural age. These characteristics of our era must also be understood within God's providence. For example, the development of the internet provides new opportunities for gospel propagation. Now, anywhere in the world, people can worship online, read the Bible, and receive Christian education. The activation of online worship during the COVID-19 pandemic can be understood in this context. Third, we must have an eternal perspective. We must view both current difficulties and successes from an eternal perspective. 2 Corinthians 4:17-18 expresses this well. "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." What does this mean at a national level? First, prayer for national leaders. In 1 Timothy 2:1-2, Paul said, "I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority." This comes from recognizing that political leaders are also under God's providence. We must pray that they make right decisions, work for people's welfare, and have hearts that fear God. Especially in modern democratic times, citizens' choices determine leaders. Therefore, it's also important to seek wisdom so that each citizen can make choices according to God's will. Second, understanding national mission. We believe each nation has unique missions and roles given by God. Just as Israel in Old Testament times had a special mission as God's people, each modern nation plays special roles within God's plan. For example, America has served as a center for world missions based on religious freedom. Britain laid the foundation for modern civilization through the Industrial Revolution, while leading the anti-slavery movement through figures like William Wilberforce. Korea, despite the pain of division, achieved remarkable economic development and democratization while playing an important role in world missions. Chapter 5. Critical Reflection and Balanced Perspective. The teaching that God governs history is sometimes misunderstood and causes problems. Let's look at several points that need attention. First, the danger of fatalistic thinking. We shouldn't think, since everything is God's will anyway, There's no need to try. Calvin's saying applies here. Pray as if everything depends on God. Act as if everything depends on you. Calvin's saying isn't his original expression but a later summary of his thought, but it contains very important insight. God's sovereignty and human responsibility don't contradict. Rather, faith in God's sovereignty should become the driving force that makes humans act more positively. Looking at history, people who deeply believed in God's sovereignty were more active in social reform. Puritans in the Calvinist tradition played innovative roles in education, politics, and economics, and Korean Christians in the Presbyterian tradition actively participated in independence movements during Japanese occupation and democratization movements. Faith in God's sovereignty gives courage to do right without anxiety about results. Because there's confidence that whether success or failure, everything is in God's hands. One can fight for justice without fear. Second, the danger of cold attitude toward present suffering. Believing in God's sovereignty shouldn't make us indifferent to those currently suffering. Rather, we should actively participate so that God's will is accomplished on this earth. It's very dangerous to tell suffering people, this too is God's will. Rather, we should hurt together with suffering people and work to alleviate their suffering. This is the spirit of incarnation. Third, the danger of triumphalist interpretation. Just because our country is doing well doesn't mean we should be complacent that it's God's special blessing. Rather, we should feel greater responsibility. Israel in Old Testament times fell into this very trap. They became proud, considering their status as God's chosen people as privilege. But God said, through the prophet Amos in Amos 9:7, "Are not you Israelites the same to me as the Cushites?" God's blessing is not privilege but responsibility. We must remember that the more blessed we are, the greater our mission. As Luke 12:48 says, "From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked." When applying these principles in modern society, there are several points to be careful about. First, the danger of political instrumentalization. We shouldn't use the belief that God governs history as a tool to justify specific political positions. God's will is not limited to any particular party or ideology. Many political leaders throughout history have claimed their actions were God's will. But in most cases, this was to justify their own lust for power. Second, the danger of cultural imperialism. We shouldn't have the attitude of ignoring or trying to conquer other cultures while thinking our culture or civilization received God's special blessing. Many Christians committed such wrongs during the Western imperialist era. They destroyed other cultures and built colonies under the pretext of gospel propagation. But this was contrary to the essence of the gospel. Third, the danger of personal prosperity theology. It's dangerous to simply interpret individual success or failure as God's blessing or discipline. The book of Job refutes such simple retributive theology. Modern prosperity theology or success theology commits exactly this error. Seeing material blessing as evidence of faith and poverty as the result of sin is not biblical. Chapter 6. God's Providence Seen Through Korean History. We can also discover God's providence through Korean history. Especially modern history shows very compressed and dramatic changes. When Joseon opened its doors in the late 19th century, who could have predicted that this small country would become one of the world's top 10 economies? 100 plus years later, exert cultural influence worldwide and simultaneously play an important role in world missions. The social contradictions and political corruption of late Joseon reached extremes. Factional politics, corruption of the three administrative systems, severe suffering of the people. But in precisely this crisis situation, God was preparing new history. First, the introduction of Christianity occurred in a very unique way. Generally, Christianity is spread by missionaries, but in Korea, Koreans first encountered Christian books in China and came to faith on their own. Lee Seung-hun's baptism in Beijing and return, Lee Byok and Kwon Il-sin's religious gatherings at Cheonjinam. All these happened before foreign missionaries arrived. This was very unusual in world missionary history. The 35 years of Japanese occupation was a period of extreme trial for the Korean people. But from a biblical perspective, there was God's special preparation even during this period. First was Christianity's rapid growth. Korean Christianity showed amazing growth during Japanese occupation. Christians increased from about 200,000 in 1910 to about 500,000 in 1945. Christianity's role in education and medicine was especially significant. Christian educational institutions like Yonhee College, now Yonsei University, Eoha Women's University, Sungsil University, and Severance Medical College were established to cultivate modern intellectuals. Many of these later became leaders in Korean society after liberation. Second, national consciousness and faith were combined. Christians played a very large role in the March First movement. 16 of the 33 national representatives were Christians, and much of the independence movements that arose throughout the nation were organized around churches. This shows that Christianity was not simply a personal religion, but one that fulfilled social responsibility. Faith in God's justice and liberation naturally connected with the national liberation movement. Third was the deepening of spirituality through suffering. Through the hardships of Japan's forced shrine worship, Christian persecution, conscription, and forced labor, Korean Christianity developed more solid faith, especially the faith of martyrs like Pastor Ju Ki-cheol and Pastor Son Yang-won greatly influenced later generations. Their martyrdom spirit became the spiritual foundation of the Korean church after liberation. The division that came with liberation was another trial for the nation. But even in this process, we can discover God's providence. Among the refugees who came down from North Korea were many Christians. The North Korean regions, including Pyongyang, had been the cradle of Korean Christianity. These people came down to South Korea and played central roles in Korean Christianity. Pastor Han Kyung-jik, Pastor Park Yun-sun, Pastor Kim Jae-jun. Many leaders who led the Korean church after liberation were from North Korea. Though they experienced the pain of leaving their homeland, this experience rather became the driving force for more passionate faith and ministry. The Korean War left severe wounds on the nation. But through this war, Korea became known to the international community, and many foreign missionaries and relief organizations came to serve Korea. Christianity's role in the post-war reconstruction process was very significant. Christian relief organizations like World Vision and Compassion helped Korea, and with their help many orphanages, hospitals, and schools were built. The missionaries who came to Korea during this period also greatly contributed to Korean church growth. Particularly notable is that the Korean church continued to grow even in the ruins of war. In desperate reality, people clung more to God, and this became the foundation for Korean Christianity's growth. The rapid industrialization process that began in the 1960s can also be interpreted as God's providence. Developing from an agricultural to an industrial nation, from a poor country to a middle-income country in just one generation, is very rare in world history. Of course, there were many problems in this process. Social chaos due to rapid urbanization, widening income gaps, environmental destruction, damage to traditional culture. But overall, Korea's economic development can be seen as providing the material foundation needed for later world missions. During the industrialization process, the Korean church also grew rapidly. Churches played important roles as people who migrated from rural to urban areas sought identity and community in new environments. Large churches like Yoido Full Gospel Church, Onuri Church, and Sarang Church grew during this period, and they later led Korea's world mission movement. Simultaneously, Christianity played a large role in the democratization process. Many Christians participated in movements demanding democratization against dictatorial regimes. Many leaders of the democratization movement, like former presidents Kim Dae-jung and Kim Young-sam, were Christians, and Myeongdong Cathedral and Yakyung Catholic Church in Jeogidong became holy sites of the democratization movement. Especially the June Democratic Uprising of 1987 was a turning point in modern Korean history. At that time, prayers like, "Let God's justice flow like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream," echoed at protest sites. Since the 1990s, Korea has come to play a very important role in world missions. It transformed from a country that received missions to one that sends missions. As of 2020, Korea became the world's second largest mission-sending country after the United States. About 27,000 Korean missionaries are sent to over 170 countries worldwide. This is very remarkable considering Korea's population and economic size. Korean missionaries are especially sent to Arab regions, Central Asia, North Africa, areas where the gospel is most needed. These regions are difficult for Western missionaries to access, but Korean missionaries effectively minister by utilizing their advantage as non-Westerners. Also, Korea's economic development experience serves as a good model for developing countries. Holistic missions combining material help with gospel proclamation are possible. The spread of Hallyu, Korean wave, including K-pop, K-dramas, and Korean movies, also has significance from a missionary perspective. As interest in Korean culture increases, interest in Christianity is also naturally growing. Even now, 75 years after division, unification remains the earnest hope of the Korean people. From a biblical perspective, we believe division is temporary, and ultimately, unification is God's will. North Korea's closed system and human rights violations clearly go against God's will. But simultaneously, we must remember that North Korea is also the object of God's love and salvation. Interestingly, the North Korean region was the birthplace of Korean Christianity. Pyongyang was called the Jerusalem of the East because Christianity flourished there so much. Spiritual giants of the Korean church like Gil Seonju, Lee Ki-pung, and Kim Ik-doo were all from North Korea. Therefore, unification has significance beyond simple political integration. It means spiritual restoration. The gospel being preached again in North Korea and churches being built can be seen as God's long-standing plan. The current size of North Korea's underground church is difficult to know precisely, but combining various information, tens of thousands of underground Christians are estimated to exist. They are expected to serve as a bridgehead for unification. Chapter 7. Eschatological Prospects. The world is experiencing rapid changes. How should we interpret these changes from a biblical perspective? First, the advancement of globalization. Due to developments in transportation and communication, the world has become one global village. This can be seen as the process of humanity, scattered after Babel, coming together as one again. But this time, unlike at Babel, it can be interpreted not as opposing God, but as the process of the gospel being preached to all nations. The fulfillment of Matthew 24:14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Actually, globalization is providing new opportunities for missions. Through international marriage, study abroad, immigration, business, etc., people from various cultural backgrounds have increasing opportunities to encounter the gospel. Second, the information revolution and development of digital civilization. Due to developments in internet, smartphones, AI, big data, etc., human life is fundamentally changing. These technologies have dual aspects. On one hand, they provide new tools for gospel propagation. More people can encounter the gospel through online worship, digital Bibles, mission apps, etc. On the other hand, there's danger of becoming new idols. Problems like technological supremacism, digital addiction, virtual reality escapism are appearing. This can be seen as modern Tower of Babel construction. Third, environmental crisis and climate change. Global warming, ecosystem destruction, resource depletion are threatening the survival of all humanity. From a biblical perspective, this can be seen as the result of misunderstanding the cultural mandate of Genesis 1, misinterpreting the command to rule as conquest and exploitation. The correct understanding is stewardship care. The independence of Israel in 1948 has very important meaning from the perspective that it fulfills biblical prophecy. Many prophetic books in the Old Testament prophesied that Israel would return to its homeland in the last days. Ezekiel 36:24 prophesied, "I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land." Isaiah 11:11 also said, "In that day, the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the surviving remnant of his people." Of course, there are various theological views on how to interpret Israel's restoration, but what's clear is that Israel's very existence is evidence showing God's faithfulness. The signs of the end times that Jesus presented in Matthew 24 are appearing simultaneously and explosively at present. Of course, these signs have appeared in various eras throughout history, but never before have they appeared globally simultaneously and with such intensity as now. But Christianity's view of history doesn't end in despair. Beyond all suffering and conflict, judgment and destruction, it ultimately promises that new heavens and new earth will come. Epilogue. Looking to God, the master of history. So far we have examined the question, why does God use human history as a stage of judgment? From various angles. What I realized most deeply while meditating on this topic is that God's judgment is not for destruction, but ultimately for restoration and new creation. Like when a gardener prunes trees, the purpose is not to kill the tree, but to make it bear more beautiful fruit. Actually, all biblical judgment stories include elements of salvation. The flood judgment had the ark, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah had Lot's salvation, and the Babylonian exile had the promise of return after 70 years. This is God's character. Righteous yet simultaneously merciful, holy yet simultaneously loving. He opens paths of grace even in the midst of judgment. Believing in God who governs history is not resignation. Rather, it's the most active attitude toward life. Because it gives us confidence that all the good things we do, all efforts for justice, all actions of love, are playing meaningful roles within God's grand plan. This can be called historical consciousness. The consciousness that my being born and living in this era is not coincidence but God's special plan. Each person has a unique mission given by God. Some are called as political leaders, some as educators, some as business people, some as artists, some as ordinary office workers. But everyone is participating in the common mission of expanding God's kingdom. Finally, I hope you remember that each of our lives is also part of this grand history. Our daily lives, the small choices we make, our relationships with people we meet, all of this has meaning within God's history. The Korean church occupies a very special position in world Christianity. The experience of achieving amazing growth in a short period, passion for missions, faith that doesn't yield even in suffering. All of this is the Korean church's asset. But simultaneously, there are challenges to solve. Division among churches, secular infiltration, next generation departure, declining social trust. These are the problems. I bless you that God's goodwill may be abundantly fulfilled in your lives as the master of history. And I earnestly hope that you too will become precious instruments used in this grand history of God. Some might ask, then should we just sit back and do nothing? Absolutely not. Rather, faith that God governs history gives us greater courage and hope, because it gives us confidence that our small efforts will not be in vain. We are called not as observers of history, but as active participants. As God's co-workers, we must fulfill the holy mission of accomplishing God's will in this era. May God's grace and peace be with you. And I earnestly pray that God's kingdom will come to your families and workplaces, churches and local communities, and further, to this nation and the whole world. Thank you.